The shift registered in the room before anyone named it. It was not a loud rupture or a theatrical declaration. It was the quieter sensation of a long-held performance finally ending, the kind of ending that leaves the previous script suddenly useless. People who had grown accustomed to a particular reading of you felt the change in the air, the way one feels a drop in temperature when a door that has been closed for a long time is opened. The version they had constructed, the one that stayed soft and accommodating and easily filed under manageable, was no longer available. In its place stood something that refused the old measurements. They had drawn a simplified outline of you and treated the outline as the full figure. Inside that outline you absorbed the small dismissals, the testing remarks, the repeated crossings of lines that should have been obvious. You smiled when the material was not amusing. You remained present when presence was taken for granted. You allowed certain patterns to continue longer than they deserved. They interpreted the allowance as evidence of limited options. They mistook the patience for an absence of alternatives. What they never accounted for was the possibility that the stillness was deliberate, that the restraint was a form of conservation rather than surrender. The moment you stopped supplying the expected performance, the entire arrangement lost its center. You did not need to dismantle the set with force. You only needed to step out of the role they had assigned. The absence of the familiar compliance was enough to collapse the cheap structure they had built around the assumption of your continued smallness. They are still standing in the resulting quiet, trying to understand how a presence they thought they understood could rearrange the sense of weight in the room so completely. There is always a version of a person that others find comfortable. It is the version that reacts on schedule, that swallows what is offered without visible cost, that remains predictable enough to plan around. For a stretch of time, that version was the one you allowed them to keep. The allowance was not an admission that the sketch was accurate. It was a temporary extension of grace that they filed without examination under the heading of weakness. That misfiling is the quiet joke that never receives the laughter it deserves. Grace extended and then misread as incapacity creates a particular kind of imbalance. When the imbalance is finally corrected, the correction feels abrupt, only to those who never noticed the accumulation. They had arranged a small theater in which you occupied the center position as a reliable prop. The prop was expected to perform on cue, to remain silent on cue, to make the rest of the production appear more substantial by contrast. They believed the stage was the limit of the available space. What they failed to register was that the figure they had placed under the lights was not learning the lines of the assigned role. The figure was studying the mechanics of the entire production, waiting for the moment when the house lights would shift and the real work could begin. Everything they had catalogued as passivity was, in practice, preparation. The stillness was not empty. It was dense with timing. Your calm had never been the absence of response. It was the presence of a longer horizon. Patience of that depth can look like nothing is happening until the moment it becomes decisive. When you finally moved, the movement did not require volume. It required only the decision to stop shrinking the available space to fit someone else's comfort. The effect was immediate. Gravity in the shared rooms rearranged itself. People who had grown used to a lighter version of you now found themselves adjusting to a presence that occupied its actual dimensions. The specific scene varies. In one setting, it is a workplace pattern of repeated overstepping that is finally met with a clear boundary instead of continued absorption. In another, it is a friendship or an entanglement that has overstayed the point of mutual regard, and the decision is simply to stop facilitating the imbalance. In each case, the surface action is modest, a conversation that does not rush to soften the truth. A look held long enough to communicate that the previous reading is no longer operative. A simple refusal to make the discomfort easier for the other person to ignore. The modesty of the action is part of what unsettles them. They were prepared for noise. They were not prepared for the quiet authority of someone who no longer needs to prove the point through escalation. On their side of the exchange, a difficult recalibration is underway. The swagger they carried was largely borrowed. It rested on the continuous assumption that you would remain inside the convenient outline. The moment the assumption failed, the borrowed posture lost its support. What remains is the more humbling work of dealing with accurate information instead of the preferred fiction. Accurate information changes tone. It changes the distance people maintain. It changes the calculations about what can be said or done in your presence. You did not need to issue threats or deliver speeches. You only needed to allow the actual dimensions of the situation to become visible. Reality performed the remaining labor. The discipline required to hold the earlier restraint is not a common operating mode. Most people, at the first clear sign of disrespect, move quickly into visible reaction. There is nothing inherently wrong with that speed. It is simply not the tempo you chose. You absorbed, processed, and continued on a schedule that belonged to you rather than to the pressure of the moment. When the timing finally aligned, the response arrived with the clarity of something long considered. That sequence is not fear dressed as patience. It is a form of internal governance that many people never locate, let alone sustain. Your silence was never the absence of a position. It was the decision that the available conversation had already been outgrown. A house that is running its own game does not spend energy arguing with noise from the cheap seats. It adjusts the conditions and allows the noise to discover the new terms on its own. They are beginning to understand that what looked like passivity was precision operating on a longer clock. The dynamic has shifted not because you became someone else, but because they are finally working with the full data rather than the abbreviated story they preferred. The grace that preceded the shift is not forgotten either. It would have been simpler and entirely defensible to address the pattern earlier, more sharply, more publicly. You chose not to. The extra runway was given. Somewhere beneath the current embarrassment is the quieter recognition that the restraint itself was a form of power they have never practiced. Genuine self-possession does not require continuous demonstration. It does not need to make an example of every available opportunity. That internal setting is among the more consequential ones a person can maintain. The illusion of your limited capacity was the primary currency they traded in. Once that currency was withdrawn, they were left examining what remained of their position without it. This is not solely a story about their reckoning. It is also the point at which certain knowledge becomes irreversible for you. You have felt the room change when you stopped reducing yourself to fit an external frame. That lived knowledge cannot be returned. It does not require announcement or altered posture. Those who needed to register the difference have already begun the process. Those who previously underestimated the depth of the discipline are mid-adjustment. Those who watched from a greater distance and already suspected the fuller picture are simply noting that the suspicion has been confirmed. What follows is less complicated than it may appear. There is no return to the earlier reductions. There is no resumption of absorbing material that was never yours to carry. There is no continued smiling at what is not amusing. No continued silence when a response is warranted. No continued cooperation with scripts written by people who never consulted the actual subject. The earlier version completed its necessary work. It demonstrated capacity under constraint. It revealed to others the limits of their previous readings. That chapter does not reopen. The shortest refusals now carry the longest echoes. Each clear boundary is heard against the backdrop of all the earlier extensions of grace. The people who once relied on the assumption of permanent availability are adjusting to a presence that no longer organizes itself around their comfort. They will not return to the language of weakness, not because fear has been installed, but because the previous misreading has been permanently corrected. The image that remains is the fuller one. It does not fade with time or renewed performance. You did not need to destroy anything. You only needed to stop authorizing the inaccurate account of who you were. That single correction proved sufficient. The success that continues from here does not require their formal acknowledgement. It does not wait on apologies that were never structurally available. The evidence of a life no longer organized around their preferred story is the only closing statement required. They were simply not yet visible to those who preferred the smaller outline. Now the outline has been retired. The space you occupy is the one sized for the actual dimensions. There is no encore for the previous act. There is no folding back into containers built by other hands. The production that depended on your continued reduction has ended. You have been finished with that particular performance for longer than the audience realized. They have only just arrived at the final scene.